Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is the Monday after Easter. It is April 6th, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. And it looks like, as I look around, it looks like spring might actually be here. I hear from my brother and folks in New England that the snow is just about melted. And theoretically, we're not going to get any more, although there were a few snow flurries in our area over the weekend. But generally speaking, I think we have turned the corner. Easter was absolutely beautiful day, and so also is today. We're looking at a little rain, but April showers, no problem. It is a pleasure to be with you at the start of a new week here at the Virtual Center. I missed our time together last week. As you know, we did a program last Monday, but we were unable to do programs on Tuesday and Wednesday for not just one reason, but for a couple of different reasons. One day was with the inability of Bob Kincaid to produce the program that day because he had other responsibilities, and on last Tuesday, I did. I was privileged to be invited to attend an 84th birthday party for a good friend of mine in Johnny County. Here it's about an hour from a drive from where I live here in Beckley, West Virginia, and it was in Monroe County, and we had a wonderful afternoon in a birthday party for a good friend, Pete Ballard, and he's just an amazing person. To be 84 years old and not have enough time in the day to do all the things that he wants to do and that he has lined up, I think it is just amazing. He is, I just envy him, and I just hope that I can age anywhere near as gracefully as he has. He just doesn't have time to grow old, and I just think it's wonderful. At some point in time, he'll just stop. And that's kind of, I think, the way all of us would like to see it end, and I think in Pete's case that's going to happen. So that was the reason that I was not able to be with you here at the Virtual Center last Tuesday. But we are looking at three days of programming this week. We'll be on our regular Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday schedule. I remind you that tomorrow, Tuesday, we'll be beginning 1.5 hour late. We'll start in the Eastern time daylight time at 1:30 in the afternoon rather than 1. But today we're at our regular 1 p.m. starting time, as we will be again on Wednesday. I do want to remind you, I believe I mentioned this last Monday, but I want to mention it again. That next week we'll have our regular program next Monday, but I'm going to be leaving town for about a week next Tuesday morning, and so next week, beginning with our Tuesday programs, we will not have our Tuesday or Wednesday program, nor will we have the following Monday program. I'm going to be driving to New England, my wife and I, and it's a family. It's not necessarily responsibility, it's a joy. But my stepson, my wife's son, is being deployed. He's in the military, and he's being deployed for 2 years. And he asked us to come up and wants to see his mom, obviously, before he goes. And he has 3 little children, three grandchildren. My wife's 3 grandchildren, all girls. And we look forward to seeing them as well. So we're going to drive up there next week and spend the balance of the week. We'll get there next Tuesday night, and we'll spend the balance of the week with David and the children and his wife, and then we'll drive back here to West Virginia. So we should be back on the air on Tuesday a week next week. But we will be doing a program on Monday, but not Tuesday and Wednesday or the following Monday. I'll remind you again of this, but I just kind of wanted to alert you that we are into our 5th month of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. So needless to say, we have a number of programs archived from the past, and I optimistically like to tell myself that we've got some pretty good programs in the can, so to speak, and we can. Many of them do need to be revisited, and I trust that Bob and the folks at Head On will select the programs, the substitute programs, appropriately for you. Again, I thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center. I thank you for your support. For your continued support, for your emails, and for the psychological support that seems to be embedded in many of the emails, as well as the occasional calls we get here on the air as well. We would love to hear from you on the air. I would love to talk, share with you conversation, and react to your ideas and your suggestions and concerns and thoughts respecting the issues that we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center. We have a phone number that has been reserved just for that purpose of getting you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. And as you know, 4676 on your keypad translates into Horn, H-O-R-N. And of course, that is a reminder that we are indeed brought to you through the support of the Head On Radio Network. Bob Kincaid and his folks have been kind enough to allow us to do these broadcasts here at of the Virtual Center on the Head On Radio Network now for going on 3 years. We're into our 3rd year, and we continue to have the support of the folks at Head On, and we continue to encourage you to continue your support for the Head On Radio Network. I think it's become more and more clear as the weeks and months have gone on as to how very, very important it is to keep this progressive alternative voice out there and on the air. And I think if you tune in regularly to Bob Kincaid's program in the evening or to some of the other programs brought to you on the Head On Radio Network, in addition to this one, I think you begin to get a sense as to the nature and the kinds of people that support and listen to the Head On Radio Network and keep it on the air. We all know that there are no funds. We have no sponsors. We basically depend on the support of listeners to keep the programming on the air here at the Head On Radio Network. So I do encourage you. It's becoming very, very clear, very, very obvious that it is absolutely vital that we keep this kind of programming on the air. Because basically there is clearly a concerted effort to silence the progressive way of looking at issues and looking at our times. I think it's very, very important to keep that voice out there and keep that perspective on the table at all times. And I think those of you who listen regularly to the Head On Radio Network know what I mean, and probably could say that a lot better than I did. But again, if you find it within your means to provide financial support for Bob Kincaid and for the Head On Radio Network's folks, I invite you to do that. Just go to the Head On Radio Network homepage, and there's a PayPal button there. And I think your support, whatever it might be, is very, very important. It doesn't cost a lot of money to keep a program like this on the air, but it costs more than any one or a few people can do. It's only through the concerted efforts of a lot of listeners contributing what they can that programming like this stays on the air. So again, I don't want to make a big financial pitch here, but I'm kind of into that, and at this moment, and I know that you appreciate how important it is. I was one of those people for a number of years. I served on the board of West Virginia Public Broadcasting for almost 20 years, and I used to do pledges on both television and on public radio periodically for public support for public broadcasting, because I believed it was so important, and I still believe that. And it's only in the last year that I haven't been doing those pledges. But I haven't wavered one bit in my faith and my belief in public broadcasting and the nature of the broadcasting and the programming that it brings to the citizens, not only here in West Virginia but throughout the country. And what I have found over the last couple of years here that we've been doing the virtual center programs is just how very, very important these kinds of programs are. So if you can find it, in your budget to help out a little bit, it would, I know, be appreciated by Bob and his folks at Head On, and appreciated by me as well. Also, if you would like to email me directly on some of the issues we've been talking about, if you're a little bit reluctant to get on the air, believe me, I can understand that. I don't mean to sound ever as if I'm being critical because people don't call. I understand that it's not easy for some people to do that, and I grew up and went all the way through school myself with that kind of a mentality. I would have died before I ever would have called this program or any of the other programs. I understand exactly what it means, and so I'm more than happy to receive your thoughts and your ideas through an email. And if you'd like to email me, I commit to the idea that I will read your email. I will take it very seriously, and if I can respond in a way that seems to be positive and in a way to thank you for the time and the effort that you put into such an effort, I will do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, BRIEN 906@gmail.com. Just a note before we get into the issues here at the Virtual Center today that I wanted to share with you. Last evening, Sunday evening, on television, on 60 Minutes, one of the issues that was being addressed was the Northern Ireland issue, and the history of the religious turmoil in Northern Ireland and the extent to which it has not disappeared, really, in spite of the fact that the violence seems to have abated some. But it's in fact they were showing such a series of walls and barriers in Belfast, which suggests that it remains a divided city and a divided people. And I was sharing, my wife and I were watching that, and I was sharing with her that my dad used to take the Northern Ireland, the Irish situation, very, very seriously. And he would always make the point of emphasizing that our last name, I-E-N, O'Brien, was not I-A-N. And of course, at that time when I was growing up, Hugh O'Brien, Bat Masterson was a very prominent television program, and we all liked that. But his last name was spelled B-R-I-A-N, O'Brien. And my dad always used to make the point that there's a major difference between E-N and I-N, between E-N and A-N. And it's the difference between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And he used to make that point very, very clearly. My wife was a little bit amazed about that little story, but every time, and I mentioned to my wife here at the Virtual Center that every time I give the email address, I spell my last name. But my major point for spelling it is that if you put I-A-N, I won't get the email. It is I-E-N. A lot of people assume that it's I-A-N, and it is not. Welcome to the Virtual Center today. We are into our first hour of today's programming, and I wanted to revisit an issue. It's been a week now since we've been together, and I don't want to go back and review everything, but you remember that we were focusing over the last couple of weeks here at the Virtual Center on the issue for the potentially for the convening of an Article 5 convention to consider the issues of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And we looked at a lot of sources related to that. We looked at the the makeup of a group called ALEX, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and its efforts. We looked at the nature of the funding that ALEX gets, pointing out that better than 99% of its funding comes not from its legislative members, but from corporate sponsors and members. And we listed a number of those: ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers and Pharma and various other groups, Peabody Coal and a number of other major corporations, SmithKline and others. And so what we suggested then, clearly, by the nature of the funding, is that the funding and the origins of the funding that ALEX receives clearly indicates the priorities of the programming. And so the model legislation that ALEC develops and runs through state legislatures obviously is very, very favorable to corporate interests and corporate priorities. As I think we can understand that. That's what they're paying their money for. And we talked about the Citizens United decision of the Roberts Court and the extent to which it contributed by allowing heavy hitters, if you will, to fund unlimited amounts of money into our political campaigns and political processes. I've been talking over the last week to a number of people who have suggested that they're pretty assured, they feel pretty comfortable saying that if the Supreme Court had it to do again, Citizens United would not have been the decision that it was. I'd like to believe that they're right, but I'm not too sure. We'll see. Because it seems to me the Hobby Lobby decision and the issues that has raised, especially the controversy in the last week, if you will, with the religious freedom legislation in Indiana, in the state of Indiana, the legislation signed by Governor Pence seems to indicate that predictably the interests, conservative interests, began to rally around the Hobby Lobby decision and focus clearly on the areas and the opportunities that the Hobby Lobby decision presented to companies and individuals to use religion as a way to pursue their own, in many, many ways, very narrow priorities, which in the case of the Indiana legislation was discrimination against in opposition to gay marriage and potentially discrimination against those who would participate in gay marriage. And so it seems to me that there are some real issues here, and we've been focusing on a lot of them. And at the same time, while I don't want to necessarily beat a downed horse to death, so to speak, at the same time, I think that it's very, very important that we give this issue its due because it is so very significant. The last time we were together, which was 1 week ago, we were looking at a Federalist paper written by James Madison, Federalist number 49. In fact, I can remember that as we signed off the year last Monday, I made it a point to suggest that when we got back together today, we would once again revisit Federalist number 49, and we would revisit this issue of James Madison's perspectives on the issues of calling a convention to amend the Constitution, and more specifically, Madison's thinking in this particular Federalist paper about getting the masses of citizens involved in revisions to the Constitution of the United States. And I wanted to revisit that because it seemed to me the last time we were together, which was last Monday, it seemed to me very, very appropriate that we go back to Federalist number 49. Some of you may remember that months and months ago we dealt with Federalist number 49 in some detail. We went through the paper in some detail, and I want to go through it again because I think it's so very, very pertinent to the issue at hand, namely the movement towards the convening of an Article 5 convention for the express purpose, in theory at least, of adding a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And what I think I've been suggesting, at least this was my intent, in the attention that we've been giving to ALEC and to the efforts to call a second convention and all the rest of it. It's one of the things that seems very clear to me is that the balanced budget amendment is not the objective of the initiative for convening a constitutional convention. And I use the term constitutional convention very, very advisedly. I remind you that Rob Natelson, who has been writing the literature and the position papers for the American Legislative Exchange Council all along, for the ALEC position all the way along, took issue with terming this a constitutional convention, and basically suggesting that it was not a constitutional convention. It was merely a convention of the states, which was very, very consistent, and yet but the latest in a long series of efforts where the state got together and made changes, proposed changes on issues of the day. It seems to me we spent quite a bit of time on this, suggesting that the labeling of this or as a constitutional convention or as not a constitutional convention seems to me to be very significant. So when I refer to it as a constitutional convention, I am doing it advisedly. I know I appreciate what I'm saying, because I do believe that Rob Natelson and ALEC, notwithstanding their efforts to try to downplay this and suggest that we needn't worry about a runaway convention because it's not a constitutional convention in the traditional sense, my feeling is that is bogus. And I think the founders tell us that whether in fact we want it to be a constitutional convention or not, the fact of the matter is it's going to be. Rob Natelson, in one of his pieces, makes the point that the Annapolis Convention of September in 1786 was a one-issue convention. If you remember, that was a convention of the states called for the purposes of commercial improvement or commercial reform among the states in order to improve the nature of interstate commerce within the states under the Articles of Confederation. And so that's what Natelson is suggesting, that a proposed Article 5 convention to consider a balanced budget amendment would be the same thing as the call for the Annapolis Convention. We spent quite a bit of time here several weeks ago looking at the Annapolis Convention. And one of the things that became very clear is that the issue was not commercial reform at all, that the real purpose for the Annapolis Convention was to get the states together in order to go way beyond the issue of commerce. In other words, it was an intentional effort to get a convention together in order to make it a runaway convention. In that case, to run away from the Articles of Confederation. I am suggesting that this one would be the same. I feel very strongly, therefore, that just as commerce was a pretext for a hidden agenda at the Annapolis Convention, and you'll remember that the French ambassador to the United States at the time made that point to Comte de Vergennes in a letter back to Paris in October of 1786. His point was that the issue of commerce was a pretext for a much bigger agenda that the major spokesman behind the calling of the convention had in mind. I'm suggesting that the balanced budget amendment is the same. And I believe that the agenda of ALEC and some of the groups that ALEC represents and speaks for is not a balanced budget amendment alone. It is to revisit the whole issue of the nature of the Constitution and the structure of government. In other words, I am suggesting that the intent behind those pushing the hardest for a constitutional convention under Article 5 is major structural reform in the structure of government in this country. In effect, it will destroy the nature of this republic. I believe it. I hope that I've been able to give here on the Virtual Center enough information so that people will at least take it seriously and consider it, because I think it's very important. Therefore, I think it is very, very interesting, more than coincidence, for Rob Natelson to use the Annapolis Convention as an example of what he means here by an Article 5 convention today. Because the fact of the matter is that the Annapolis Convention in reality was exactly what I believe Natelson hopes this convention will become. A runaway convention that will go way beyond the issue of a balanced budget amendment. Even though I feel, and I think I've said this more than once, I feel that the balanced budget amendment by itself would create such dangerous change in our system of government. It would render government unable to govern in the public interest. And I think that alone would do substantial damage to the republic. But the issue is those behind the convention want to go much beyond that. We looked, about a year ago, we looked at Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments, and there were more than 10, I believe there were 11 amendments that he proposed. Balanced Budget Amendment was one of them, but it was not the only one. In other words, these people for a long time have been thinking about and planning an agenda that they would basically place on the table once a convention is convened. I think we know that, and I think we need, therefore, to consider it and be very, very aware of what is going on. One of the most, I think, one of the clearest papers ever written on this subject is Federalist Number 49 by James Madison. And I think, therefore, to go back and revisit Federalist Number 49 in this context is more than appropriate. I think it's beneficial. I think it reinforces some of the issues involved. It makes clear I believe some of the issues and some of the dangers involved. And so that's why a week ago, when we were together for the last time here at the Virtual Center, we began to look, we didn't get very far, but we began to look toward the end of the program at Federalist Number 49. And I had promised that we would revisit it again. And that's what I would like to do today. Over the last week, however, other issues have surfaced. I don't mean to imply that these issues take precedence over Federalist Number 49. In fact, the issues that I would like to share with you provide the kind of context which I believe makes Federalist Number 49 even more important to look at and reconsider than it was last week when we proposed to do that. I want to bring to your attention an op-ed piece that appeared in the Easter Sunday Washington Post, yesterday's newspaper, April 5th. It is a column by one of the regular columnists in the Washington Post, Colbert King. I don't know how many of you are regular readers of the Washington Post. I don't know how familiar you are with the writings of Colbert King. Mr. King has been writing for some time in the Washington Post. I do believe that this is the first time here at the Virtual Center in the 25 months that we've been coming to you on this program. I believe this is the first time that I have mentioned Colbert King by name. I think that's significant. I don't I haven't intentionally not mentioned Colbert King before, but it seems that his piece yesterday was so appropriate and so timely and provided the kind of context for consideration of Federalist Number 49 that I felt that it was absolutely imperative that we address it. So if you'll permit me, I would like to share with you Colbert King's piece from yesterday's Washington Post as context, as background, in order to create, in other words, for the perspective that I believe it provides for this examination of Federalist Number 49. We are at 30 minutes after the hour, so we have reached a halfway point of our first hour together, and I'm hoping that we can cover Colbert King's piece rather quickly in order to create the perspective, because I would like the bulk of our program today to be focused principally on Federalist Number 49. Most of us, I think, are aware of the kinds of things that are happening in the country. We know the situation with the negotiations with Iran on some sort of a nuclear treaty, which seemed to produce some sort of result last Thursday, and we have gotten the competing reactions to that particular issue. The president sat down over the weekend, it seems to me, for an extensive interview in which he explained that he believes that the treaty negotiated with Iran is the best chance that we've got to avoid a nuclear war in the Middle East and all the rest of it. We've talked about that. We've also considered here at the Virtual Center the address delivered a month ago, early in March, before Congress, by Benjamin Netanyahu, who was invited by Speaker of the House John Boehner, without presidential approval, without even the president knowing that the invitation had been extended. And Netanyahu's address, which warned of the dangers of any kind of nuclear treaty with Iran and how it would backfire and it would play right into the hands of the Iranian efforts to take over control of a volatile Middle East. We know about the letter signed by 47 members of the Republican Party and sent to the president of Iran, warning them about the nature of our constitutional system and how that whatever the president did and whatever agreement they thought that they had with the president really wouldn't hold any water, because it was very likely that without congressional support for that position, that the president would be promising things in such an agreement or an accord that he couldn't deliver on. This was the letter drafted by Senator Cotton of Arkansas. We talked about that. So what we've talked about, it seems to me, is the seeming dysfunction that is occurring in in Washington between the bipartisan sides, conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, and the extent to which it is directly affecting the president's ability to conduct foreign policy. We've talked about how much of this opposition to the president might be personal. We've talked about whether, in fact, it constitutes disrespect for the office. We talked about the degree to which it might reflect, it might create precedents or establish precedents which would be to our detriment, to the detriment of future governments in order to negotiate foreign policy agreements with other powers, et cetera, et cetera. This is the kind of context that Colbert King writes in. But I wanted to share with you because it seems to me this is the context within which I think we need to look at Federalist Number 49 as well. The title of Colbert King's piece in yesterday's Washington Post is, quote, "A Rising Insurrection Against Obama," unquote. And this is the introduction, this is the context within which Colbert King presents his argument. It's a scary thought, he says, but here it is. If some red states were to openly defy the authority of President Obama in the exercise of his constitutional duties, would today's Republican Congress side with him? Or would they honor the insurrection? That's the question that Colbert King raises. Has the hostility and the volatility that exists between the Republican-controlled Congress and the President of the United States, has the situation become so partisan that it actually raises the question as to whether the participants in it would support the insurrection against the president rather than see the constitutional crisis that such an insurrection seems to portend? Colbert King says, I wish it could be said with confidence that the legislative branch would oppose a rebellion against the executive branch of government, but I'm not so sure. I guess the reason I'm sharing with you here at the Virtual Center is because I'm not too sure either, to be honest with you. Last month, Colbert King points out, the Republican-led Arizona House of Representatives passed 36-24 straight party line vote a bill sponsored by Tea Party Representative Bob Thorpe of Flagstaff, Arizona. And this is the bill that the Republican-controlled Arizona House of Representatives passed last month. Quote, it, quote, prohibits this state, Arizona, or any of its political subdivisions from using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with an executive order issued by the President of the United States that has not been affirmed by a vote of Congress and signed into law as prescribed by the U.S. Constitution, unquote. Let me repeat verbatim the legislation proposed and passed by the Arizona House of Representatives. It is a bill that prohibits, quote, Arizona or any of its political subdivisions from using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with an executive order issued by the President of the United States that has not been affirmed by a vote of Congress and signed into law as prescribed by the U.S. Constitution, unquote. Let's look for a second at the nature of that legislation. First of all, it amounts to insurrection against the President of the United States because it is clearly implied that the President's authority to issue executive orders is being challenged by this law. In other words, the only thing that this majority in the House of Representatives in Arizona is agreeing to is they will obey whatever comes out of Washington provided Congress passes it. But if it comes from the White House as an executive order, this legislation forbids the state or any of its subdivisions from obeying it, from enforcing it, from helping to administer it, or even to cooperate with such an executive order. In effect, this House of Representatives is limiting, if not abolishing, the president's right to use executive orders in order to govern. Where does the Arizona legislature think it has the power to do that? The only difference between that and nullification itself is that nullification refers to legislation that is passed by Congress and the states refuse to obey. In this case, what they are refusing to obey are executive orders coming from the President of the United States. What it means then is that any executive order issued by the President would have no force in the state of Arizona. It is insurrection. Yet the issue, and this is the point that Colbert King makes in his article, the issue is that Arizona did this and there has been no response on Capitol Hill. In other words, Congress has not reacted to this, which could be interpreted that the Republican majority in Congress is in favor of this kind of insurrection. And that then takes us back to the initial question that Colbert King opens the article with. If there were a decision to defy the authority of the President of the United States to exercise his constitutional duties, would today's Republican Congress side with him or would they side with the insurrectionists? And King is suggesting in this article that the silence on Capitol Hill indicates that the Republican majority is siding with the insurrection, not siding with the executive branch of government. Then, if you look at this issue in the context of the other factors, other issues that have happened over the last few weeks in this area around Washington, the letter of the 47 Republican senators to Iran, sabotaging the president's ability to conduct foreign policy, or the letter op-ed piece in Lexington, Kentucky on March 3rd, in which the Republican president of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, told states to ignore the Environmental Protection Agency's mandate for clean power regulations. And this is a quote from McConnell's op-ed piece. Think twice before submitting a state plan, McConnell said. Hold back. In other words, he is encouraging states to not go along with orders coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency. He is encouraging states to revolt against the ability of the federal government to govern. In this case, an agency of the executive branch, the Environmental Protection Agency. And then this past week, Mitch McConnell spoke to nations who are members of the United Nations. Specifically, and this is taken from Colbert King's article, Mitch McConnell told countries involved in negotiating a UN-brokered international climate change agreement that they should, quote, proceed with caution, unquote, because of intransigent opposition to President Obama's efforts to significantly scale back U.S. carbon emissions. In other words, Mitch McConnell is injecting himself directly in international negotiations surrounding climate change in the United Nations. And he is going outside the parameters of the legislative branch, of his role as majority leader in the Senate. And he is directly injecting himself in international diplomacy, in contradiction to the President of the United States. In effect, what King is suggesting in this article is that the level of insurrection and obstinacy coming out of, not only coming out of Washington, but coming out of the Republican majority of Congress in Washington, and the degree to which it is condoning insurrection at the state level, suggests a major operational dysfunction in the ability of this government to govern. You can look at this, and I've been thinking about this, I've been talking to different people about it. You can look at it in a number of different, you can look at this as directed against the president personally. I've heard more than one person make the case that if the president was not African American, this whole controversy wouldn't even be happening. In other words, suggesting that the racial realities of this situation govern it. It's hard, obviously difficult to prove that. It's difficult to disprove that. But it also suggests dysfunction among the branches, the separation of powers issue, it seems to me, the checks and balances issue, and all the other factors associated with the structure of the way our government is designed to operate, the federal relationship between the federal government on the one hand and state governments on the other. It seems to me that when you begin to put all of this together, you raise serious functional questions about the nature of the republic itself. Is this the context? Is this the time when we ought to be thinking about a constitutional convention? If you assume that the entire purpose of a constitution is to reach agreement, is to bring different parties together, bring people together in the interests of negotiation and compromise and honest deliberation, is this the kind of context that we would even want to risk the danger of a convention called for purposes of amending the Constitution of the United States? However you look at it, whether it's a constitutional convention in the traditional sense, whether it's a convention of the states as Rob Natelson chooses to define it, whatever you call it, the context, it seems to me, suggests that this is a very volatile time. This is a very risky time. Colbert King reminds us in his piece that a few years ago, in March 2012, 3 years ago, in a newsletter of the Republican Party from Greene County, Virginia, in March 2012, called for, quote, armed revolution, unquote, if President Obama won re-election that coming November in the 2012 election. Open, the suggestion of open armed rebellion against this particular president if he were to be reelected. At that time, the Virginia Republican Party and the Republican Party on the national level tended to downplay and poo-poo this and suggest that this shouldn't be taken seriously and all the rest of it. It was considered to be obviously extreme and not something that should be taken too seriously. The GOP leadership for the county in Virginia, Greene County, Virginia, responded to that piece by saying, quote, "We do not believe that if the results end up with the reelection of Barack Obama, that will necessitate what the author suggests." So in essence, there's an effort to kind of tut this and suggest, we don't need to take this too seriously. But I don't think, and this is the point that Colbert King makes at the end of his article, 150 years ago, we had a very similar situation in this country in the person of the president at that time, who happened to be Abraham Lincoln. And we know that in that particular situation, hatred of a president and that president's policies produced civil war. We remember that Abraham Lincoln was accused of misusing presidential power, of subverting the Constitution and trampling over states' rights. He was accused of being a tyrant, bent on destroying what the South referred to as a superior civilization, unquote. And then, and King makes this point, and then, as now in the situation with Barack Obama, Lincoln was portrayed as a simpleton, as a buffoon, and as a coward. And I ask you to think about some of the portrayals of President Obama. If you have been privy in the last few days to see the emails coming out of members of the police department in Ferguson, Missouri, which caused them to be fired. Personal, insulting, racist emails directed at the President of the United States. I would suggest to you that Colbert King is really onto something here. He is suggesting that the circumstances surrounding the attacks on Abraham Lincoln and the circumstances surrounding the attacks on Barack Obama are so similar as to be almost eerie. He is also making the point that 150 years ago, we were not able to counter the direction of these assaults. In other words, these situations were prelude to civil war. And he is suggesting that today's situation shows very many indications of being prelude to civil war as well. And what we are seeing is that those whose responsibility it would be to deal with these threats, to counter them, to challenge them, are actually part of the issue. They are precipitating the situation rather than fulfilling their constitutional responsibilities to address these situations. Mitch McConnell, as president of the Senate, as majority leader in the Senate, I keep saying that the president of the Senate is the Vice President Biden. I know that. Senate Majority Leader McConnell holds a position of authority, he would be expected not to participate in these kinds of activities, but to challenge them and counter them and find ways to deal with them. Instead, he's originating them. He's encouraging the insurrections at the state level. He's challenging the executive authority of the President of the United States. He's overstepping his bounds by engaging directly in international affairs. He is taking upon himself the conducting of foreign policy, as did the 47 members of the Senate who signed that legislation, and Mitch McConnell was one of those. And while there's every indication that many of the senators who signed that letter have had second thoughts and wish they hadn't done it, the most outspoken one, of course, is John McCain. The fact of the matter is there's a pattern. There's a pattern underway here. I think it's something that we all need to take very seriously and we all need to recognize and consider. I ask you to think of this situation as background, as context for consideration of a convention called to amend and alter the Constitution of the United States. When we know that there are influential people involved in the initiative for that convention, whose agenda, whose goals, whose objectives go way beyond the balanced budget amendment, which is the pretext for the call for the convention. I think all of us need to deal with this. I think all of this is background and context to Madison's Federalist number 49. I say this because Madison's position in Federalist number 49 has been challenged. It has been challenged by reputable people, reputable scholars. The one that I have in mind, probably more prominent than any of the others, is Garry Wills, the author of Inventing America on the Declaration of Independence and the author of Explaining America on the Federalist Papers. Garry Wills, in Explaining America, has written one of the most incisive, I think brilliant, exposés on Madison and Hamilton and the Federalist Papers that I've ever read. And while he clearly is a supporter of Madison and Hamilton and is convinced of their sincerity and their concern for the Union, for the Republic, Garry Wills attacks Madison straight up on Federalist number 49 because of the positions that Madison takes against the role of the people and the responsibility of the people to effect change in the Constitution of the United States. I guess what I'm saying, as we come to the completion of our first hour, we're going to be taking our break in a moment, is that I take issue with Garry Wills on this particular situation. I take issue with his criticism of James Madison in Federalist number 49, and the principal reason I do it is because of the context we just looked at. I believe that Garry Wills' criticism is based on fears and concerns which have no basis in fact. when looked at against the situation that we are currently in this country. Gary Wills wrote his book in 1981, 34 years ago. His position at that time was ideologically sound and ideologically consistent. But I do believe that his position against the situation that we're dealing with today is unreasonable. And that's the context in which I'd like to look at this in our next hour as we revisit Federalist number 49. We have reached the top of the hour. It is 2 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our second hour here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you'll stay tuned. After a short break, we'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center.
I'm sorry. I hope that wasn't too abrupt, Bill.
No, it was. It was fine. You were fine. I was I was sending you an email, and I was halfway through it. I don't type that well, Bob, and I was sending you I ran into my brother sent me a 5-minute video of a performance by Eric Clapton and Pavarotti.
Oh my!
That it just will not be believed. I'm going to forward it to you when I get off the air.
Cool. I look forward to hearing it.
It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. It's a piece. It's a religious piece that Eric Clapton had written, and they did a duet on it, and it is absolutely astounding. It's amazing. But I know you'll like it. I'll send it to you when we get off the air.
Good deal. All right.
Welcome back to the Virtual Center. This is our second hour on this Monday. It is the 6th day of April. It's the day after Easter in the year 2015. We welcome you to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, we thank you for staying with us. That means a lot to us. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to the Virtual Center. We will be launching into a review, and I say that because we did deal with Federalist number 49 some months ago. But once again, we will be looking at James Madison's Federalist paper number 49 in the context of the initiative or the efforts to convene an Article 5 convention for purposes of considering a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. If you weren't here for the first hour, then what we did in the first hour was kind of lay what I believe is a very significant context for this particular reading of Federalist number 49. For your reading pleasure, we focused on a piece, an op-ed piece by Colbert King in yesterday's Washington Post, the April 5th Washington Post, under opinion, the column by Colbert King, in which he talks, King basically talks about the Republican-led opposition to President Obama in the areas of foreign policy and executive management, if you will, and contrasts the opposition and the nature of the challenge to presidential authority that we are experiencing today to the opposition and the allegations of constitutional malfeasance leveled against Abraham Lincoln 150 years ago. And Colbert King makes the point that at that time, the situation contributed to the Civil War which follows. King's suggestion, obviously, is that we better be careful that the situation we are witnessing today is not also prelude to civil war in this country. And I made reference in that context, of the 3 racist emails coming out of Ferguson, Missouri. They were made public this weekend. If you've seen them, they're available on the internet, that caused the authors of these 3 emails, 2 of them were police officers in Ferguson, Missouri, and I believe the other one was some sort of an elected official or an appointed official, I'm not sure what, but somebody in the government of Ferguson, Missouri. But they were dismissed as a result of the racist nature of these emails. But what they suggest is the same kind of hatred and unwillingness to compromise and unwillingness to negotiate and to deliberate that Lincoln faced 150 years ago. And of course, Colbert King's position is that an awful lot of this is being orchestrated and directly coming out of the Senate and the President Mitch McConnell as Senate Majority Leader, who is actively encouraging states to not abide by executive orders coming out of the White House. Very, very significant. And of course, the key issue that faces us all is, with this kind of a situation going on in this country, is this the time we want to think seriously about reconsideration of the Constitution of the United States and the process for amending it? It's hardly conducive to the ideas of deliberation, negotiation, and compromise that would seem to be kind of the have-to-haves in order to even think about putting the Constitution of the United States on the table in this kind of a context. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's area code 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. I mentioned at the end of our hour, as a lead into this one, that Gary Wills, in his book Explaining America, which was written in 1981, and is extremely supportive of the Federalist Papers, of the efforts of Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, and the approaches that Madison uses specifically in Federalist Number 10 and Federalist Number 51, with the checks and balances and separation of powers and all the rest of it. Gary Wills is extremely critical of Madison for Federalist Number 49. Because in Number 49, Madison takes on James Madison's support for the role of the people in Republican government. In fact, Gary Wills makes the point in his book that one would almost think that Federalist Number 49 was written by Edmund Burke rather than by James Madison, because it is so much in favor of government, so much supportive of government power. And Gary Wills' point is that when we think of Madison and his support for Republican government and the checks and balances system and the separation of powers system, we are inclined to see James Madison as an advocate of for those who fear abuses of power by government. But in Federalist Number 49, Madison seems to step out of character, according to Gary Wills, and becomes an advocate of government power and an advocate of limitation on the ability of the people to affect government in this republic. He's very critical of Madison, and he basically suggests that this Federalist Number 49 seems to be out of character for James Madison. I would suggest, however, that in light of the context which we've just been looking at, the situation that is happening in this country, I would suggest that we may be witnessing today in the 21st century a situation which Gary Wills never could have contemplated 35 years ago when he wrote his expose of the Federalist Papers, Explaining America. It seems to me Wills was writing at a time when most people tended to look at the classic political struggle that goes on in popular government between the powers of the people and the powers of government, and the animosity that exists between those two. And Wills seems to be assuming that Madison should fall on the side of the people questioning the power of government. And therefore, he finds it totally out of character for Madison in Number 49 to be so supportive of government against the ability of the people to affect it. And specifically, what Wills finds to be very uncomfortable is the fact that Madison takes Jefferson on in this context. In other words, this is one of the few situations in which Madison takes issue with Jefferson's support for consent of the governed. And so I think we ought to consider that also as we look at number 49. So with spending all of our time on context, it seems to me we have an obligation to spend some time in the substance of Federalist number 49. So let's get into it and see if we can utilize this, our second hour, and get through Federalist number 49. And again, we will be doing our regular program tomorrow at our regular Tuesday time, which will be 1/2 hour later. We'll be beginning at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time rather than our normal 1 p.m. start. And if we need to use a portion of tomorrow's program to complete number 49, we'll do that. In the opening paragraph of number 49, Madison pays homage and expresses his respect for Thomas Jefferson and the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. And I'll share this with you, but we can kind of fly over it very quickly because I think it's very supportive. In the opening, it's very supportive of Jefferson. He says, the author of the Notes on the State of Virginia, and of course that's Thomas Jefferson, quoted in the last paper, Federalist number 48, has subjoined to that valuable work the draft of a constitution, which had been prepared in order to be laid before a convention expected to be called in 1783 by the legislature for the establishment of a constitution for that commonwealth. Again, let me translate that because it's kind of a run-on sentence. What Madison is saying is that Jefferson, the author of the Notes on the State of Virginia, put together a draft constitution which he prepared for a convention that he expected would be called in 1783 in Virginia in order to establish a constitution for the state of Virginia. This was Jefferson's contribution to a draft constitution for such a convention. The plan, Madison says, like everything from the same pen, marks a turn of thinking original, comprehensive, and accurate. In other words, he's very, very complimentary of Jefferson here. He said that draft constitution, like everything that Jefferson writes, smacks of originality, deep thinking, and accuracy, and is the more worthy of attention as it equally displays a fervent attachment to Republican government and an enlightened view of the dangerous propensities against which it ought to be guarded, it meaning Republican government. In other words, not only should Jefferson be credited for the value of this draft constitution for what it contains, but it also indicates Jefferson's fervent attachment for Republican government and Jefferson's enlightened view of the threats, the dangers that Republican governments face. One of the precautions which he proposes, Madison says, and on which he appears ultimately to rely as a palladium to the weaker departments of power against the invasions of the stronger, is perhaps altogether his own, and as it immediately relates to the subject of our present inquiry, ought not to be overlooked. And then Madison quotes this particular proposition from Jefferson's draft constitution for the state of Virginia. Jefferson says that whenever any two of the three branches of government shall concur in opinion, each by the voices of 2/3 of their whole number, that a convention is necessary for altering the Constitution or correcting breaches of it, a convention shall be called for the purpose, unquote. What Jefferson's contribution addresses, or Constitution addresses, then, is the idea of separation of powers by suggesting that when two of the branches are in agreement that change in the Constitution is necessary, then these two ought to be able to join together in order to call such a constitutional convention. In other words, when two of the three branches of government, Jefferson said, believe that the constitutional situation calls for change or for amendment, then it ought to be appropriate that a convention called for altering the Constitution shall take place. This is what Madison is dealing with, is this particular proposition. Madison goes on and says the following about that particular proposal. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority, not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments on the chartered authorities of the others. In other words, Madison, at this point, is very supportive of Jefferson's proposal about the calling of a popular convention, a people's convention, for the purpose of revising the Constitution. Madison said this is perfectly in tune with the idea of Republican government. It's perfectly consistent with the idea that the people are the only legitimate fountain of power. That's the way he expresses it. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and as it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived. In other words, all the power that the branches of government has comes from the people. It seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory, he says. It's very consistent with republicanism to go back to that same authority, in other words, to the people, not only whenever it's necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of government, but also whenever one of the departments commits encroachments on the authorities of the others. In other words, if there seems to be a breakdown in government, in the structure of government between the different branches, Madison is saying Jefferson's right. It's very consistent that very consistent with Republican theory that we would go back to the fountain of power, which is the people themselves, and call the idea of a convention in order to fix it. Makes perfect sense, Madison says. The several departments being perfectly coordinate by the terms of their common commission, none of them, it is evident, can pretend to an exclusive or superior right of settling the boundaries between their respective powers. And how are the encroachments of the stronger to be prevented, or the wrongs of the weaker to be redressed, without an appeal to the people themselves, who, as the grantors of the commissions, can alone declare its true meaning and enforce its observance? In other words, it stands to reason that no one branch should have the power to decide how much power it should have or how little power the other branches should have. That makes sense. So given the fact that no one branch ought to be the one that makes the decision in this, it stands to reason that we would go back to the very beginning, the people themselves. So in other words, up to this point in time, Madison is very supportive of Jefferson's proposal that when two branches of government come together and agree that they can go call a convention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Madison says there's certainly great force in this reasoning, and it must be allowed to prove that a constitutional road to the decision of the people ought to be marked out and kept open for certain great and extraordinary occasions. So up to this point, then, Madison is totally uncritical, totally supportive of Jefferson's proposal. But that's as far as he goes. He said, but there appear to be insuperable objections against the proposed recurrence to the people. as a provision in all cases for keeping the several departments of power within the constitutional limits. Madison says there's a problem. While it seems consistent with Republican government, while it seems to be the right way to go, while it seems to be reasonable that no one of the three branches ought to have the power to determine how much power it has or how much power either of the other branches has, and therefore it stands to reason that the only thing left is to go to the people, there are problems, Madison says. What are they? Well, Madison goes into them. He says, in the first place, the provision does not reach the case of a combination of two of the departments against the third. Madison raises an issue. What's to keep two branches of government from ganging up against the third one? If the legislative authority, which possesses so many means of operating on the motives of the other departments, should be able to gain to its interest either of the others, or even one-third of its members, the remaining department could derive no advantage from its remedial provision. Madison is addressing the obvious issue here. The legislative branch of government in Republican government, the division into three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, the one with the most power in Republican government, by definition, will be the legislative branch. It's potentially the most powerful of the three because of its size and because of the number of people in it, the fact that it has representatives from all over the country. And these representatives are in direct contact with the people who elected them. So by definition, an abuse of power by any of the three branches, Madison is suggesting, would most likely come from the legislative branch. Under Jefferson's proposal, what's to prevent the legislative branch from lining up against one of the other two branches, either the judicial branch or the executive branch, and ganging up on the third? Nothing. In our situation today, Madison would say, what's to prevent the legislative branch from linking together with the judicial branch against the executive branch? What's to prevent Congress and the leaders of Congress from reaching some sort of an alliance or an accord with the judicial branch, the Roberts Court? What would happen to the power of the executive if that ever happened? I'm suggesting that that's exactly what is happening. When you look at what's coming out of the mouth of Mitch McConnell in terms of urging the states to openly rebuke the power of executive authority coming out of the Obama administration, and you link that with the decisions of the majority of the Supreme Court, which is making decisions in Citizens United on the funding of political campaigns, and the idea of corporations being persons, the same court who renders in decisions like the Hobby Lobby decision the right of corporations and companies to use First Amendment religious rights and freedom as a protection for discriminatory purposes, then in a sense what we are seeing is a combination of the two branches of government are coming together to render the third, the power of the Obama administration, effectively null and void. They are questioning the president's ability to make foreign policy. They are questioning the ability to issue executive orders. They are urging the states to not go along with executive orders, but only when Congress passes it or supports it. In other words, they are challenging the right of the president to make executive decisions. They are challenging the right of the president to conduct foreign policy. And in the process, I think they are belittling the executive authority of the office. It seems like they may be taking opposition to the man, to the person sitting in that office, and doing serious damage to the office itself in the process. I would suggest then that Madison's first concern about Jefferson's proposal for two branches of the government to get together in order to engage in constitutional change has problems. I think we're seeing them today. I think Colbert King's article raised them. Therefore, I'm suggesting that Garry Wills's criticism of Madison for his criticism of Jefferson may be a little bit misplaced. But in giving due credit to Garry Wills, we have to recognize that he wrote this 35 years ago, and the situation we are seeing today was not even dreamed of 35 years ago. Madison goes on. In the next place, he says, it may be considered as an objection inherent in the principle that as every appeal to the people would carry an implication of some defect in the government, frequent appeals would in a great measure deprive the government of that veneration which time bestows on everything, and without which perhaps the wisest and freest governments would not possess the requisite stability. Madison's raising a real issue here. Every time you appeal to the people and suggest that there's a defect in the government that needs an amendment, that seems to call for change, the more you do that, the more frequently you do that, the more you raise questions in the public mind about government's legitimacy itself. If you keep going back to the people and suggesting this is wrong, that's wrong, something else is wrong, then what you are doing is creating in the public mind serious questions about government itself. Therefore, you are weakening people's inclination to support their own government. You are weakening the very foundations of government itself. And you are suggesting the need for the people to come back together and make changes. When you do that, you are obviously suggesting that there are weaknesses in the constitutional structure that need fixing. Madison said that's a message that you don't want to send to people. He goes on. If it be true that all governments rest on opinion, it is no less true that the strength of opinion in each individual and its practical influence on his conduct depend much on the number which he supposes to have entertained the same opinion. That seems to be very confusing and very vague. But Madison clarifies it in the next sentence. The reason of man, Madison says, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. What Madison is getting into here is the nature of human nature, is the issue of human nature itself. And what he's saying is people by themselves, alone, acting alone, tend to be cautious and timid. They tend to be a little bit unsure of themselves, unwilling to stand out there and take outrageous, outlandish positions on issues, unless they know that there's a lot of people that think the same way they do. In other words, what Madison is saying here, the more you can count on the fact that there are other people that see things the way you do, the more willing you are to stand up and take issue with what's happening. In other words, the more people agree with you, the braver you get in your criticism. If you're the only one that's being critical, you tend to be a little bit timid, a little bit cautious. You're not sure how people are going to take what you're saying. But if you become the member of a mob, everybody in a mob suddenly becomes brave. And Madison is saying this as a matter of human nature, and if you think about it, he's right. People tend to be brave when they're a member of a group. They tend to be a little bit less brave when they're standing out there all by themselves. It's one thing to lead, but if you turn around and realize that there's nobody behind you, then you become a little bit uncertain, a little bit unsure of yourself, a little bit more cautious, a little bit more timid. And Madison said, this is the reason of man. This is like man himself. This is the way people are. So then he goes on and explains himself. When the examples which fortify opinion are ancient as well as numerous, they are known to have a double effect. In a nation of philosophers, he says, this consideration ought to be disregarded. A reverence for the laws would be sufficiently inculcated by the voice of an enlightened reason. If we were a nation of philosophers, Madison is saying here, we really wouldn't need to worry about this, because we would be an enlightened nation made up of enlightened philosophical types who think deeply about these issues and take positions advisedly. But Madison says, let's face it, a nation of philosophers is as little to be expected as the philosophical race of kings wished for by Plato. In other words, if we think that we have a nation of philosophers and deep thinkers and enlightened people, we're dreaming, Madison says. And in every other nation, the most rational government will not find it a superfluous advantage to have the prejudices of the community on its side. We are a nation of people that doesn't function as independent philosophical types who think through the issues and take positions advisedly. We are a people that function, Madison doesn't say this, but what I think he's implying here is kind of with a herd mentality. We look for support. We function in groups. The more people we can find to agree with us, the braver we are. And the fewer people there are who agree with us, the more timid and cautious we are. And what Madison is suggesting is you take this principle and apply it to the call for a constitutional convention. If you're issuing issue after issue after issue and suggesting the Constitution needs changes here and it needs changes here and this is wrong and that's wrong and the other's wrong, then what you do is you create in the public mind questions about the strength and legitimacy and efficacy, if you will, of the constitutional system itself. And therefore, when you create that kind of environment, people become brave because they know there are people out there who agree with them, that the system isn't right and it has to be fixed and we need to do that and we need to do this. And that, ironically, it seems to me, that's exactly what Madison is doing, is describing where we are today. Think about what people are saying. Think about what the critics and the conservatives of the Obama administration are saying about health care and about foreign policy and about the nature of Obama's foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. This is wrong. That's wrong. He can't do this. He can't do that. There aren't enough jobs. The budget's too big. We're operating at a deficit. Da-da-da-da. People are taking advantage of the system. The safety net is too big. There are too many people living off the labor of other people. There are too few people taking care of themselves. the sense of responsibility is gone. People aren't willing to take responsibility for their own actions anymore. They're always looking for other people to blame. This is wrong. The educational system is falling apart. Foreign power, the Middle East is exploding. This is wrong. That's wrong. Racism. After a while, people become overwhelmed. And by definition, people become joiners. They join in this, and they begin to look for the weaknesses and the strengths. Madison is saying you don't want to kick off a mentality like that. You don't want to start pointing out this is wrong in the Constitution, that's wrong in the Constitution, we need this change and that change, because you're going to create that kind of a public mentality in the nation, and that's not good. I would suggest to you that when you look around in today's world, and you were looking at the number of people, prominent people, who are urging open rebellion and insurrection and obstinacy against the government of the United States, we are in that kind of a situation. This is not the kind of a situation when we want to be calling second conventions. I think Madison is right on here. The danger, Madison says, of disturbing the public tranquility by interesting too strongly the public passions is a still more serious objection against a frequent reference of constitutional questions to the decisions of the whole society. This is not the time when people have so many doubts about the leadership, about the Constitution, about justice, about fairness, about equality, and all the rest of it. This is not the time when you want to turn to those very same people and say, come together and fix this. You don't want to do that, Madison is saying. Notwithstanding the success which has attended the revisions of our established forms of government, Madison says, and which does so much honor to the virtue and intelligence of the people of America, it must be confessed that the experiments are of too ticklish a nature to be unnecessarily multiplied. Madison is saying here, granted, we did a great job. We brought people together in the period of crisis, at the time of war, and they created government. They created state governments and state constitutions. They did a great job, Madison says. We are to recollect that all the existing constitutions were formed in the midst of a danger, the war, which repressed the passions most unfriendly to order and concord, of an enthusiastic confidence of the people in their patriotic leaders, which stifled the ordinary diversity of opinions on great national questions. In other words, when we wrote our constitutions, our state constitutions, Madison is saying, we did so at a time of war. People were under pressure. They tended not to emphasize their disagreements, but to look for places that they agreed. They needed to come together. They needed to negotiate. They needed to compromise. This was not the time to partake in disagreements. This was the time to reach accord, to reach agreement. When we developed our current constitutions, Madison said, we did it under the pressures of war. We did it in the context of a time when no spirit of party connected with the changes to be made or the abuses to be reformed could mingle its leaven in the operation. In other words, we were of a mind when we created our state constitutions that we needed to find ways to get together and put aside our differences and find a way to cooperate. What Madison is saying is that's the best frame of mind in which to develop constitutions. But that's not the frame of mind we're in now. Madison says the greatest objection of all to Jefferson's proposal is that the decisions which would probably result from such appeals would not answer the purpose of maintaining the constitutional equilibrium of the government. The greatest objection of all to this idea of bringing the people back in convention to fix the Constitution, the greatest objection to this, Madison says, is that the decisions which would probably result from such appeals would not answer the purpose of maintaining the constitutional equilibrium of government. We would do more damage than we would help. We have seen, Madison says, that the tendency of Republican governments is to an aggrandizement of the legislative at the expense of the other departments. We know that the greatest threat to Republican government is excessive abuse of legislative power. We know that. The appeals to the people, therefore, would usually be made by the executive and judiciary departments. It stands to reason that if the legislative department or the legislative branch is the one to be most afraid of in a republic, it stands to reason that going over their heads would probably be resorted to by the other two branches, the executive and the legislative. But whether made by one side or by the other, Madison said, would each side enjoy equal advantages? Let's view their different situations. What Madison is saying is, let's look at the situation here. The members of the executive and the judiciary departments are few in number and can be personally known to only a small part of the people. On the other hand, the latter, the legislative branch, by the mode of their appointment, as well as by the nature and permanency of it, he's talking about the executive and the judicial branches, and he says, the executive and judicial branches, by their mode of appointment and by the nature and permanency of it, in other words, the judges are appointed for life, because of the nature of their jobs, they are too far removed from the people to share much in their what's the word that Madison is using here? Prepossessions. In other words, what Madison is saying here is that the members of the executive and or the judicial departments are too far removed from the people to be effectively able to appeal to the people. But the legislative branch, because it's so directly connected to the people and it's represented of them more than anybody else, then appeals to the people, the legislative branch would have the most authority. They would have the advantage. And we know that in Republican government, it's legislative abuse more than anything else that we need to be most careful of. He says the members of the legislative branch, on the other hand, are numerous. They're distributed and dwell among the people at large. Their connections of blood, friendship, and acquaintance embrace a great proportion of the most influential parts of society. The nature of their public trust implies a personal influence among the people, and they are more immediately the confidential guardians of the rights and liberties of the people. In other words, when there's an appeal to the people, the legislative branch has all the advantages because they have the context. They're closer to the people. There are more of them. They're related to the people. They interact with the people. They're elected directly by the people. So consequently, if we're going to fix constitutions by appeal to the people, then we are giving more authority to the legislative branch of government than we are to the other two. And that's exactly where we don't want to go, because in a Republican government, the legislative branch is potentially always the abusing branch. But Madison goes on and says even more. He said, but the legislative party would not only be able to plead their case most successfully with the people, they'd probably be constituted themselves the judges. Now Madison's getting into who these legislative leaders are. The same influence which gained them election into the legislature in the first place would gain them a seat at the proposed convention. If this should not be the case with all of them, it would probably be the case with many. and pretty certainly with the leading characters on whom everything depends in such bodies. In other words, once you call a convention, it's going to be the most influential people within the legislative branches who are going to get elected to these conventions. They're going to be the spokesman. They're going to be the most adamant. They're going to be the most doctrinaire. They're going to be the most ideological. They're going to be the most dangerous. They're going to be the most extreme. These are the last people that you want to be making changes in your constitutional structure of government and getting support from the people for those changes because of the influence they have with the people. In today's world, we've been talking about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. We've been talking about the power and the influence they have because of the money they've been able to pour into local elections in support of Tea Party candidates. They own these legislatures. They own the leaders of these legislatures. Do we want a constitutional convention called by them? With them writing the agenda? Them considering the election? These are the most ideological, dangerous people. They're the last people you want to be making constitutional changes in our structure of government. It is, to me, unbelievable that James Madison is saying this in 1787, 1788. And it applies so directly to the political realities of the world we live in 2015. I think Colbert King laid it out. The administration is under attack. The old idea of the advantages of the presidency because the president has the bully pulpit is all beginning to change because of social media, because of technological change, because of the ability of the media, the number of media outlets, the ability of the Mitch McConnells and the Ted Cruzes and the Marco Rubios and all of those people to get on the evening news at night on the cable channels and all the rest of it. In other words, their ability to pummel and attack and criticize the executive branch is so powerful and so overwhelming that it's created a world that Madison and the founders never dreamed of. In the process, it's jeopardizing our republic itself. It is jeopardizing the very structure and nature of our constitutional system. And here's Madison 200 years ago, 200 and some years ago, warning us of this kind of situation. Gary Wills criticized Madison for Federalist Number 49. More specifically, his criticism of Jefferson's reliance on the people. But what Madison is laying out here is this isn't reliance on the people that we're talking about. This is the danger of demagogues who are manipulating public opinion to support the agenda that they want to implement. And now they want a convention to do it. And Madison is saying in that kind of politically volatile situation, you don't want the Constitution of the United States on the table, ever. Because the public mind is not, we are not a nation of philosophers, Madison said. We are not a nation of enlightened, deep thinkers. We all don't think independently and make our decisions independently. We're members of communities. We're influenced by what other people say and what other people tell us. The more it seems like there are people who agree with us, the more bold we become in our statements, the more bold we become in standing up for our positions. And so what this becomes is a world tailor-made for demagogues to take over and initiate changes which conform to a particular agenda that they have. And Madison is saying Jefferson is wrong. There's no way that he's not criticizing Jefferson. He's giving Jefferson all the accolades about his brilliance and his intelligence and everything else. But what he's saying is what Jefferson is proposing in the realities of the political world that we live in, Madison says, is dangerous. And we don't want to subject our Constitution. We don't want to suggest the nature of Republican government to this kind of a volatile, politically charged environment. Madison says the convention, in short, would be composed chiefly of men who had been, who actually were, or who expected to be members of the department whose conduct was arraigned. They would consequently be parties to the very question to be decided by them. The most interested, the most biased, the most prejudiced, the most ideological people would be the leaders of this convention. They would be the ones who would be making the proposals and drawing up the model amendments that the convention would consider and potentially adopt. Madison said this is not the kind of a political environment in which you want to take up constitutional change. He said there is the danger that the president would be so popular with the people that the president's agenda would dominate such a convention. But the fact of the matter is, it's more likely that the legislature is going to do that because the legislature is more plentiful. There are more of them. They're scattered around. They know everybody. They're elected by the people. So these are the people that are going to have the voice of the public behind them. Therefore, these are the people who become the most dangerous. They are the most ideological and they are the most dangerous. They are the ones that are pushing hardest for a convention, because when it comes time to choose the people who will sit in that conventions, they are the ones who will be chosen. Because what they have done is they have used their influence to get elected a group of yes men, so to speak, the so-called Tea Party, who vote in unison. What we're seeing in our partisan world of politics today is that these people are voting in groups. They are voting the party line. They are not voting as individuals. They are not thinking independently. They are voting in groups. They are voting as they are told to vote by their leaders. And it's those leaders who are behind the push for a convention, and it's those leaders who will dominate it. It's those leaders who will draft the potential amendments, and it's those leaders who will come out of such a convention literally running this country, that the republic as we know it will be destroyed. I think Madison is talking to us from his grave here. In opposition to Gary Wills, who believes that Federalist number 49 is a major flaw in Madison's armor, I think in many ways Federalist number 49 is Madison's greatest ideological triumph. I think Madison is coming to us in this Federalist paper and is speaking to us for the real world applications of the world we are currently living in. We are seeing it all around us. We are seeing who the spokesmen for change are, who the people looking to be nominated by their parties for office are. These people have political agendas. They are running for office. They have vested interests in change. We have a Supreme Court that has gone along and has made it possible for large corporations and large donors to literally buy congressional seats and legislative seats. They have literally bought state legislatures. They have taken control of state legislatures. They're importing model legislation and running them through legislatures that they control. Now they want a constitutional convention that they will control. They literally want to be able to recommend the kind of changes that they want to the fundamental laws of this republic. And they are relying on the power and the influence that they have over the electorate to pull it off. We cannot let that happen. Madison is right. This is not the time. This is not the context that we want constitutional change to be taking place in America. It is 59 minutes after the hour. And to be honest with you, I wasn't sure we could finish this, but we did, and I appreciate it. We'll be back together again tomorrow, 1/2 hour later, 1:30, here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow. And I want to encourage you to continue to support the Hit On Radio Network, the network that brings you programs like this one. Thank you so very, very much. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe, and thank you.